Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Monday, April 18th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined by two old friends who have been on our program before. Matt Dunne is the founder and executive director of CORI, or the Center on Rural Innovation, which is a nonprofit organization based in Heartland, Vermont. It's focused on rural innovation and entrepreneurship. And Julianna Dodson is the director of Radically Rural, which is based in Keene, New Hampshire. It started as a summit meeting in 2018, and they will be holding a summit meeting again this year in this coming September. But it's also a partnership between the Hannah Grimes Center for Entrepreneurship and the newspaper, the Keene Sentinel. And it has moved beyond a summit to a year-round programming that's offered in areas that are showcased at the summit. So, Matt and Julianna, great to have you both with us. Thank you for making the time for our conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Great to be with you.
Well, I thought we could get started by just talking a little bit about what you're both seeing in terms of trends in terms of population and business startups in rural areas as we hopefully emerge out of the pandemic. I say that sort of in quotation marks because I've used that term before, and well, we're seeing probably another subvariant lurking out there. But I guess I was just wondering, and Matt, let me start with you perhaps. Are there, one of the concerns that we were all hearing a lot about was population declines in rural areas, and then that seemed to turn around a bit when the pandemic began 2 years or so ago. People began moving out of urban areas into rural areas and were able to work remotely, do things that didn't seem to be possible before. I just wondered if, at this point, are you seeing that trend continuing as we go forward, and maybe more businesses starting up in areas that needed an injection of business entrepreneurship, or is it kind of still a stable holding pattern?
I would say a couple things. One is that there was a migration to rural places, but it wasn't always equal, right? Some parts of the country saw more of a migration than others, which was usually based on, where there were natural amenities or vacation areas or that kind of thing, was seeing a lot larger impact than places that might not have that kind of history and trajectory. The other piece, though, that I think has been pretty exciting is that there has been an opening of the aperture among business investors as well as others, that ideas and new entrepreneurial endeavors can take place anywhere. And that wasn't the case before, particularly in the area that we zero in on, which is specifically scalable tech companies. So we're not as broad as Radically Rural is in looking at all forms of entrepreneurship, which are critically important. We zero in on those scalable tech areas. And we've seen a jump since 2017, where of all of the venture capital in the country, only $3 billion was going to rural zip codes. In 2021, that had grown over time to $45 billion. So that's a big leap. And I don't think we can account for all of it because of COVID, but I think it's a part of it, which is looking at things in a broader context. The only other thing that I would add is that, we have this moment where in some places we've seen increases in people moving to an area and bringing their job with them. And that's exciting, but it's not the everything. Right? Zoom towns have their limitations. If people are simply taking their job and spending all their time in their spare bedroom of their new house and not engaging in the community as a whole, becoming part of that ecosystem of the economy around them, it's only going to have limited value. And so we're in a moment where I think some of the places like the Hannah Grimes Center and others can really play a strong role, same with the Black River Innovation Campus in Springfield, of actually bringing those new residents together, making them feel a part of a larger community that they may not have even thought existed when they were moving up to a very different place.
And Julianna, what's been your takeaway on that?
Yes, I agree with really everything that Matt said. And just to kind of give an example of his final point, which was those who may have moved and are working remotely and how to get them engaged in the community. We recently had someone move from New York City and they're now working remotely in our Hive co-working space at the Hannah Grimes Center. And they have reached out trying to find ways to engage with the community. And that, that's just one example in the last week of what has happened consistently during the pandemic. And there's lots of folks who we aren't reaching, who are working remotely and may not know who to reach out to try to find opportunities to engage. And we appreciate the ones that are taking initiative to try to do that. That individual in the co-working space did attend our last roundtable talking about welcoming and supporting new Americans. They followed up since then. So that does happen. But again, depending on, what we're seeing is that although there was a really strong initial influx into rural communities, the most rural communities have seen a drop back down. Those who aren't surrounded by more metropolitan areas where you can have easy access to interactions with other folks on a larger scale and resources and entertainment and so on and so forth, that those areas, the most remote, have really dropped. That's what we're seeing. And then those who may, let's take Keene as an example, roughly 22,000 population, surrounded by a lot of smaller rural towns, but we have just enough to kind of keep folks engaged and have enough opportunity for folks to get excited and maybe want to stay. So I think it's a little bit of a mix is what we're seeing, but as Matt said, it's really important to figure out ways that those folks who have moved and are making that move at least semi-permanent can get engaged and really be a part of the community in a constructive and more long-term impactful way.
So what are you both seeing in terms of advantages that rural areas offer to businesses or to entrepreneurs who would like to, operate in a small town or small city? Whether it's a startup or expanding an existing operation, are there certain benefits that when you're talking to entrepreneurs or business folks, you say, hey, the reason you ought to be in this town is X, Y, Z, ABC. Matt, let me go back to you. Are there some arguments that you make that you're seeing resonating with those entrepreneurs and business folks?
Well, even though many of us have been feeling the impact of the cost of real estate going up, and that's a real issue that I think all the way across the two states people are feeling, the cost of real estate compared to where a lot of these folks are coming from is still infinitesimal, particularly when there are community-based shared spaces to be able to engage, whether they're formal co-work spaces or they are leased opportunities to be able to have an innovation hub in their area. And when that place has high-speed internet, right? The ability to get high-speed internet is super, super important. And there were some folks who bought homes without checking whether they had high-speed internet, and they're suddenly going, oh, we need to be there. But when you have that high-speed internet, when you have proximity to a university campus, and so that there is a source of talent that's coming in, and you know that you are able to get to metropolitan areas relatively easily, sometimes from a small airport that still has regular flights or a drive or a train or whatever else, you can really make a compelling case that it's a lot better to ideate in an area where you have a lower risk profile, because you're not having to make major outlays of capital to be able to get your idea into a workable product and eventually to market. And you can also find community. Especially when there's intentionality with a place like Black River Innovation Campus or the Hannah Grimes Center, being able to actually bring that support that you'd usually have to wait in line for a long time in an urban place to be able to do that. The other interesting piece that I think we all sort of take for granted is the accessibility to folks who are in Congress and in government otherwise. There is so many resources right now coming out of the federal government, mostly via states, that are specifically about stimulating the economy in a wide variety of ways, both in a resilient way, but also in just trying to make sure that we are propelling people into new entrepreneurial endeavors that will help sustain things moving forward. And having that access to your congressional delegation, to your legislators, to others, is a huge advantage that you just don't find in bigger cities or in states with big, metropolitan areas where you just get lost in the shuffle.
And I'll just tack on
Now
to
you're
that.
nodding,
You
I
know,
see.
Matt's already addressed it sort of from a meta or like a big picture perspective. So I'll just give an example that might be more interesting to hear about, as far as, instead of me just repeating the same thing, that we had a company, a biotech company out of the Netherlands, DTAC Diagnostics, who had heard about Keen from someone who had graduated from Keene State and has been in biotech for 20 years and is now an advisor for them. And when they were trying to determine where they wanted their first US location so that they could seek their USDA, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but the certification for them to be able to have their product in the US, they specifically sought out Keene because of it being a small and supportive community. When they were here, we talked, in a week's time, we were able to rally local government, state government, funders, community members. The list just goes on in 1 week's time when they did their tour here, and they were supported and listened to and encouraged and cheered on. And we have been able to essentially provide all the needs that they had in order to have their first US location. They needed a CLIA lab. Keene State is going to partner with them on that. They needed an office location that's being provided by the Hannah Grimes Center. They needed funding. We were able to rally a lot of different connections for them to get the funding that they needed. And they specifically said when they gave us their presentation that it was FDA, sorry, approval, I just thought of it. They specifically said when they were giving their presentation that they were seeking out a community that was similar in feel and in size to, I'm not going to say this right, a guttural in the back of your throat, like Groningen in the Netherlands. And they said that they really got that same sort of feel for the community when they were here, because they didn't want to just get lost in the mix in Boston or New York. They could have easily gone there. But they wanted a place where if they needed help moving equipment, somebody would be there. If they needed help, personal help, that someone would be there. And I think all of the resources that they needed were able to be found, and they specifically wanted that in a community like ours.
I was wondering, one thought I've been having over the past couple of years since we started hearing a lot about supply chain interruptions and the fact that all these important computer parts or something else were kind of tied up in some port somewhere or on a container ship sitting outside a harbor that was not going to be able to unload for 30 days or something incredible like that, is that this might present an opportunity to the U.S. economy as a whole, but also to rural areas to kind of bring back some of the manufacturing that was outsourced or offshored, whatever the right term is, 30, 40, 50 years ago when the globalization of the U.S. economy began to really take force. And I was wondering, as you talk to folks within the business community, is there any sense that some of them are thinking, hey, I just can't deal anymore with waiting for something to come to me from China or overseas when we could make it maybe right here or in some place in the U.S.? Is that conversation by any chance underway?
So yes, I would say we are hearing that conversation happening a lot. And, Matt is in he's kind of targeting a different demographic than we are, so to speak, but we definitely are hearing that conversation happening. And I think there's a reckoning happening on a larger scale too, with there's anything in society and in people in general, there's like a pendulum that kind of goes from one direction to another. And I think that we're starting to have a reckoning on a larger scale that a certain coming back to our roots, so to speak, is needing to be done in a lot of ways, while still pushing for forward momentum and progress, but also reaching back to what has actually worked and what could work again. And so, for example, I think let's take the supply chain with food. I think a lot of folks who were in New York City or other larger urban areas during the pandemic, and they go to the grocery store and the shelves are empty, and that feeling of panic and fear, like, if I can't get it here, where can I get it? And wanting that desire to be a little closer to the source of their food. I think that is certainly true with other aspects of the supply chain as well. And so there is that swing back to, we need to keep this a little closer so that we can have a little bit more assurance that if we need something, we're going to be able to get it. And I'll let Matt speak to it now.
Well, what I would add to that is that in the tech space, which is what we're in, we're also seeing an interest in reshoring technology jobs and computer jobs. And it's interesting, we just did an analysis on the missing tech jobs in rural places. And in fact, there's a lot of non-tech companies that typically does hire tech talent. Hospitals, banks, others who insurance companies, those kinds of things. And unfortunately, those folks have been outsourcing that talent, sometimes overseas and sometimes to Brooklyn, right, for 3 times the price, because they've come to the conclusion, oh, we can't find that talent here, even though there are people, right down the road who are either in those skill sets or are coming out of Vermont Technical College or Keene State with those skills. And so we're trying to do some of that bridging. But I think especially, with the unfortunate situation, or the devastating situation in the Ukraine, you're seeing a lot more need for that tech talent. Cybersecurity is becoming a much bigger issue, and folks are actually entertaining the possibility of bringing that kind of work back home and into rural places. And that can be very positive on building the whole ecosystem, right? Because those folks who are working for the hospital or the bank, doing computer software development, front-end development, or cybersecurity, can eventually become part of startups and other kinds of enterprises once they know that there's a community of other people working on the same thing. So we are seeing that trend as well as people looking to reshore manufacturing jobs.
Well, Matt, you bring up an interesting point that I wanted to ask earlier, but maybe I'll just jump on it right now. One of the things we've heard a lot about in terms of population trends in the U.S. is that the U.S. population has kind of plateaued to a degree. It's not really growing. It hasn't been growing in the last couple of years, certainly since the pandemic. And one of the sources of new talent and just labor force that we're going to need to keep the economy growing is going to be from immigrants, folks from overseas. And as you just mentioned, with the awful situation unfolding in Ukraine right now, there are people leaving there. Potentially, some of them might arrive here. We've seen many immigrants from many different countries wanting to come to the U.S. How critical an ingredient, and particularly in the rural arena, is this idea of having folks coming in from overseas to be here? And is it your sense, will they be welcomed? Will they be seen as contributing to their communities as opposed to not contributing in some way or another?
No, I think it's absolutely critical, and I think we're at a really interesting moment where we're seeing Afghan refugees who are coming into our communities and becoming a part of those. But look, we've got a shortage of folks who are able to be a participant, and I would say a limitation of rural places is if you are not welcoming of a diversity of perspectives and ideas, you're limiting your effectiveness in the business world. You're not going to be in a place where you can create the new kinds of technologies and innovations that can move things forward if you're just going to be talking to the same people over and over again. So what we have seen is that the places that have been fully welcoming, that have been very, very explicit in wanting to have either refugee communities or other kinds of new Americans at various status of transition are succeeding. And those that have not are seeing their communities continue to hollow out. And I think there is a real decision for leaders in rural places as to whether or not they want to be that welcoming place that can be a part of a future of the United States, or somehow get stuck in where they were before. And I do think the labor shortage has, again, opened up some folks' eyes to this possibility who might not have thought about it in as positive a way. When you have difficulty finding a contractor to do anything before 2024, right? You suddenly are like, oh, I guess we could invite more people to be a part of this overall mix. But that has not been without some tough conversations. And we have seen, our communities, many of which are at the forefront of this work, still going through fairly absurd arguments over critical race theory in schools, or trying to, proclaim that somehow it's refugees and immigrants, even the very small amounts that are doing harm in their areas, as opposed to taking it as a moment of self-reflection of what are things that we can do better, and to make sure that we are welcoming of that diversity of talent and ideas and solutions to allow for our economies to move forward, and frankly, for the next generation to want to stay in our beautiful downtowns throughout our rural communities.
And Julianna?
Yes, just short answer, it is absolutely essential that rural communities welcome and support newcomers to America. And it's in their best interest too, to do that, for bringing in creativity, diversity of perspective, innovation, so on and so forth. And then, as Matt said, workforce, simply. There's a lot that goes into it, but we must do that. And there are some towns that are very interested in doing that work and others that aren't. And I think that there are so many components to it, and it does take a larger conversation to get all the players in a community on the same page about it. There's Schuyler, Nebraska, that out of population of like 7,000, I think it's 70 to 80% are newcomers to America. And not only are they being brought there, but they're being sustained after they get there. And there's a lot that goes into that. It's not easy to bring people in, but it's easier than helping them find a place long-term and sustaining them long-term. And so that conversation has to be had too. So we bring people in. Well, are they going to be able to find a place that is familiar with how to cut their hair? Are they going to be able to find the food that they like? Are they going to find folks to spend time with that are welcoming? I mean, there's so much that goes into sustaining folks after they get here. And so, in the case of Schuyler, Nebraska, it's a lot of there are programs that are very supportive, like foundations and organizations, but a lot of it is private business that's bringing these folks in and supporting them. So there's private business at play, there's entrepreneurs, there's government, there's nonprofits, there's community members. There's so much that goes into that conversation. And so it does have to be intentional, and so that so that it's not just a matter of, sure, come on, but what then? Will they feel at home, and will they feel welcome? And it is essential work to be done, and something that we should all be talking about regularly.
And to say nothing of housing, which is a subject we could probably talk about easily for the rest of the show, just about, because here
A whole
it seems
day,
like
we could talk about that all day.
here in our corner of Vermont, to the extent that we've been welcoming some folks from overseas to come here, the big issue is finding places for them to live. Well, of course, and a lot of people are struggling with that. But let me just move on here, and Julianna, to stick with you here for a second. You recently had a roundtable discussion as part of the Radically Rural program back in January about growing rural entrepreneurial ecosystems, and you had a couple of folks on who were talking about some of the keys to small town or small city resilience and rebuilding. I wondered if you could just talk to us a little bit about what were some of the keys that you felt emerged out of that conversation, and what you thought were really important for, small towns, small cities that were trying to, thrive instead of just survive.
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that. So, everyone kind of has their different perspective on what the main things are, the key takeaways. But from what I've observed as I've been listening and learning from other rural communities, there are a few key things that stand out to me. One is that it's always a multi-pronged approach. It's like if you go with a top-down strategy and a bottom-up strategy and a lateral strategy, like at some point they kind of all merge and some things work. So you have to really come at it at a lot of different directions for it to be successful. Being willing to rethink things, I think, is also an essential piece of it. So if something isn't working and it hasn't been working, then how can we do something different? So an example is there's a place called Franklin in New Hampshire that at one point was, I believe, a manufacturing town, and then suffered decline after that manufacturing shut down. And now they are using one of their natural resources, these White River Rapids, to essentially revitalize their economy using this as a focal point for folks. And so kind of having that ability to rethink and be creative and use the resources that you have at your disposal are essential. There's a documentary that just came out called Song of Salt about a community in California that has been dwindling for the last, I'd say 50 years. And communities that are so dedicated to their place and want to remain there will have to rethink in order to be able to remain there. There were other pieces that he brought up in there: commitment, investment, perseverance. A lot of these things are not fixed, certainly not overnight, sometimes not even, sometimes it's decades before you see payoff to some of your investment. So perseverance is essential. We have a brownfield site here, not even a mile away from me, that we've been working on and off for almost 2 decades here in our town. And it's just the next person pick up the torch and keep going. Being willing to accept external help, empowering leadership and community agency. There's a lot of things that he brought up during that, but overall, I would just say that bringing everyone to the table, being willing to be creative in your approach, being committed, finding folks who believe in let's say you're trying to revitalize a town, believe in the town, are willing to put in the time and the effort. But it's hard. I mean, we're going to have a roundtable during the summit this year talking about volunteer support and how tricky that is, to find volunteers instead of just the same people over and over coming to the table. How do you find more folks who are willing to come in and be a part of the conversation and help? Because a lot of small towns do really depend on volunteer power.
In the few minutes we have left, and there's like a whole host of questions here I'm like dying to ask, but I'll just try to limit it just to one, and Matt will let you address this one first, because I know we're running out of time here. Climate change. How is that going to impact rural areas in particular? I mean, it's going to affect everyone in some way, whether you live in New York City or somewhere in the middle of Nebraska. But what is your sense so far as to what rural areas should be doing to kind of prepare for what the world might look like in 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, well, it's going to certainly depend on where we are in the country when you're talking about the impact. But we're already seeing climate refugees in our region, right? We're seeing people who are already saying, okay, I see this coming. I want to get to a place that is going to be more resilient, where I can have a sense of community, where I can actually have a little more control over where my food stuff comes from, where my energy comes from, and all of that. And I do think rural is in a unique position to be able to create more self-reliance, more of the energy of the future that's going to be carbon-free, and to be able to unlock ideas in a different way to be able to solve some of these problems ahead of us. But I would also say that rural places, particularly micropolitan areas like Keene and Springfield and others, really demonstrate a place where you can come and have a more sustainable lifestyle, where you no longer have to be within a 20-minute subway ride of all of your customers in order to be able to affect global markets and to be out there. You can create these incredible enclaves of innovation and ideas and new companies that can come out of these smaller communities, have those communities being unbelievably walkable and connected to one another, and really redevelop those downtowns to the place that they used to be, and allow for us to get into more of an equilibrium when it comes to our carbon footprint and where the economy is thriving.
And Julianna, we'll let you have the last word on this one. Any sense as to how climate change may, negatively or positively affect things?
Well, I'll just start by saying rural America acts as the lungs of America, and it will continue to. And I think the value of rural America will continue to become more and more in the spotlight, because in the past, it feels like rural America has had to sort of, yell into the void the value that they bring. But it will become very apparent as we continue to accept more climate refugees, and as our lands and spaces and forests are used to breathe for America and used to generate the energy that we need in order to be sustainable. So that's a topic that I would love to unpack further with more time, but for now, I will just leave it at that and say that it certainly is impacting and will continue to. But what I love is that what I'm seeing is the innovation coming out of rural America is astounding. I can't even absorb it. I cannot, it is like, it is pouring out, and everything that we are doing is being rethought in a way that is more sustainable and will benefit our world in the long run.
Well, I guess that means we'll have to have you both back on at our future shows where we can unpack some more stuff, because boy, there's a lot to unpack for sure. But I guess we're just going to have to leave it there for today. Again, I want to thank you both for making the time for our conversation. Matt Dunne is the founder and executive director of CORI, the Center on Rural Innovation, based over in Heartland, Vermont. And Julianna Dodson is the director of Radically Rural, which is based over in Keene, New Hampshire. Thank you both very much. I really appreciate your time. And thanks to all of you who've been watching our show today. I hope you found the program interesting. And we'll see you again the next time. For now, I will leave it there. Thanks again.